a little bit about that across the line position at the top of the backswing and really what we need to understand in terms of how to get rid of it. A lot of golfers don't necessarily pay attention to the right things. They understand what they could do differently in order to change that, but they don't understand how it got there, and that's a big piece to the puzzle. And a lot of it has to do with the shaft movement and specifically the handle of the club really early in the takeaway, believe it or not. Okay, so when you see this across the line position for a right-handed player like myself, that means that the shaft is pointing way in front of my body to the right at the top of the swing. Okay, so there are certain moves we could do to correct that. So for example, one of the common things we'll see with a golfer who's very across the line is they're going to have a very internally rotated shoulder on the trail side. Essentially what that means is this elbow is like retracting behind the player. Think of like you're winning an arm wrestling match. This elbow is retracting behind you while you're winning it. That's internal rotation. If I just stick my hand out, okay, and I'm going to place it onto the club like this, well, creating internal rotation as I separate this elbow, I'm also applying a force to the hands forward that way when I'm internally rotating the shoulder, right? So if I'm standing here and I have the club in my hands and my shoulder goes into a lot of internal rotation in the backswing, that could apply a force to the club, which gets the shaft very across the line. That's one of them, right? Well, a golfer could see that and say, okay, well, why don't I just prevent the internal rotation? Why don't I keep the elbow more pinched in, more external, right? Something like this here. So it would be the opposite movement. So for example, if I stand here and I pinch the elbow in, I'm actually going to start doing this to the hands. So what's going to happen is I'm actually going to lay the shaft off. So that is a way in which a golfer can get rid of the across the line position at the top, obviously, right? Okay, that's one option. Sure, that's fine. We could talk about the levels of forearm rotation. So for example, if I stand here, well, if I roll my forearms open towards the top of the backswing, so for me as a right-handed player, that means I'm rolling my forearms to my right. Okay, so that is actually called pronation of the left arm for me as a righty. Okay, so I'm doing that. Well, that move there, if I put the club up in the air and I start to create that type of forearm rotation, I am going to start to lay the club off. Again, this is something that you could do as a counter method to the across the line position. So as you're going up to the top, if this golfer starts to twist the forearms early, and in my case as a right-handed player that's to my right, that could counter the across the line position and get the shaft a little more in line with the target or even a little laid off, right? Fine, that's another one. But a lot of golfers don't necessarily understand how they got into that across the line position. A lot of it has to do with the takeaway. You can work on all those drills you want, but if you're working on them at the wrong times, they are going to penalize you even worse than you think you are, okay? So what do I mean by this? Well, if the club is already in a shallow position really early in the backswing, meaning the handle of the club is very parallel to the floor early on, I'm not hinging the club up in the air, right? It's kind of like this, horizontal. A lot of golfers typically will roll the forearms early, get the club inside, or they're kind of like very dead-handed and don't have a proper hinging pattern. Well, if I get this shaft angle too flat going back, and now I'm saying, okay, well, I need to get this club up in the air. A lot of golfers get the club up in the air through that internal rotation, which gets them across the line. So a lot of times when you see that across the line position at the top of the backswing, it is only getting there because it was actually really horizontal early, and you're doing things with your body that maybe you don't like doing, like that internal rotation, to get the club up in the air, which gets it across the line. Fine, okay. Well, if you just look at the top of the backswing and you don't necessarily understand how that was created, well, you're going to look at that and say, well, why don't I just externally rotate my shoulder to get the shaft angle more laid off? Well, imagine if your club is already laid off in the backswing and now you're preventing the shoulder from going internal to get the club up in the air. Now you're doing the drill that you're trying to do, right? You're here at the top. Well, you're trying to prevent that by pinching the elbows together to get the shaft more laid off. Fine. But if the shaft angle was already horizontal early in the backswing and you're trying to keep them together, you didn't get rid of the root cause of the problem. You only got rid of the compensation late in the backswing. The compensation being, well, you were already very horizontal with the shaft. You were creating an environment where your trail shoulder had to move internally to stand it up. And that comes with that same forearm rotation, which gets it across the line and everything. So you can look at the top of the backswing and see that across line position and say, okay, well, I'm trying to fix it and I'm doing the movement patterns according to biomechanics that will fix it. Sure. But you are fixing the compensation. You are fixing the reaction late in the backswing that is getting you across the line without fully understanding why you're there to begin with. The reason why you're there is because the shaft angle was horizontal early and you needed to stand it up late, which got it across. Meaning if all you're doing is getting rid of the compensation, the root cause of the problem, that inside early takeaway is still there. You're pinching the elbows together now and preventing the forearms from turning. And all you're doing is getting super laid off, super flat. You got no chance. It's equally problematic as the across the line position, if not maybe even worse, right? So you need to understand that the reason that top of the backswing pattern exists is because of the handle of the club. We have to get this handle of the club up in the air first, vertically, to offset the fact that when you try to pinch those elbows together, you are going to start to lay it off. Keep in mind, when you're across the line, if you're pinching the elbows together, that is going to lay the club off. In order to prevent it from getting too laid off, you need to first have the shaft angle going up relatively vertical in the early stages of the backswing to offset that, right? So what I would do with a player is I would get them an alignment stick, just put it between the lead hand and the grip, and say, okay, well, if you're trying to work on this, try to work on making sure that you are hinging the club through your actual wrists upwards in the air to get the club standing, meaning the handle of the club is actually pointing to the ground now. I'm not horizontal and inside early. I have a little more of a neutral and upward hinging pattern to the actual handle of the club. Now the shaft is in a spot where the root cause of the problem doesn't exist anymore, and now you can work on pinching those elbows together to get the shaft angle less across the line. So if you don't fix the takeaway, which is oftentimes a big root cause of the problem, you trying to just correct the across the line position at the top is meaningless, because all you're doing is you're correcting the reaction. You're not actually getting rid of the reason why that across the line position exists. So you need to understand that the movement pattern to the shaft early on is super important to offset the fact that when you use those variables in your swing, those movement patterns, to get rid of the across the line position, you don't end up super laid off. If you're horizontal early and you're preventing the club from getting across the line, all you're going to do is stay super horizontal and flat, right? The reason that the across the line position exists is because of that. So if we get this club up in the air a little sooner, a little more vertical, get the handle of the club pointing to the ground sooner, right? And that's why the stick is there, just as an extra visual. Well, then you can use those variables that we just discussed, those movement patterns, those drills, to get the shaft laying off without it ending up too laid off. Now you have a good spot to the shaft at the top of the swing. So I hope this helps you.